10:15, that's not bad. I mean, I was really worried about starting to talk to you, and I don't know how you're feeling, but I'm feeling better now. I'm feeling a little better. It takes me about 15 minutes, I think. So let me just read the first paragraph on this opening. This is from Merton's Thoughts in Solitude. And I think there are a couple copies left, so if you have not bought any books, you might want to grab this one before the day is over. Thoughts in Solitude. He wrote it in the 50s, and I'm going to take some quotes from that book. It's a beautiful book. And from the beginning of that book by Merton, his own introduction, that first paragraph, he writes, "There is no greater disaster in the spiritual life than to be immersed in unreality. Our life is maintained and nourished in us by our vital relation with realities outside and above us. When our life feeds on unreality, it must starve. It must therefore die. There is no greater misery than to mistake this fruitless death for the true, faithful, and sacrificial death by which we enter into life." Now that's just how he kind of starts the book. And we could take that paragraph, I promise you, we could stay with that all day long. We could take every 3 or 4 words and kind of hunker down and think about, what does this mean? He's saying quite a bit. I added some more things. I'm not even going to read those out loud. This is enough. What I'll pull out of this, though, to start, is that Merton, in his sense of contemplation in the monastic life, the silent life, the spiritual life, was, if it was about anything, it was about reality. He didn't want just a religious life. So he was a little rambunctious when he came into the monastery, in a sense. He had not lived a religious life. If you turn to the white page, I won't keep you dizzy, but if you would like to look at some of those dates, let me tell you a little bit about Merton's life, the early years before the monastery. And then we'll go back to the blue page and read a paragraph about attention, and attention to reality. This is Merton. To me, this is one way today to talk about Merton, is that Merton wanted to attend to reality. He didn't want anything else. Henry David Thoreau is another person I love to read and study and learn from. Talked about reality in the same way. He says, I want to feel reality. I want to feel it in my bones. If it's not real, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Just give me reality. It was a craving of his soul, not a fake life, not a fake existence. Now that's someone who Seneca, the Roman philosopher, would have understood. Don't give me this quick and dirty kind of spiel of an exciting life. What is really life? And I'm life. What am I really? And what am I in life? I don't want any fancy answers. I don't want a program or a plan. That's why Merton is a little rambunctious for some people. He's a mystic, and that can be trouble. So we may come back to that as well. All right, let's look at some of the early years about Merton and get a sense of how he starts on this road to be attentive to reality and why he would be so concerned with this. He's born in France. It's not until the 50s that he becomes an American citizen. So Merton is born in France. His mother was from New York. She was a Quaker. His father was from New Zealand. He was not religious, though his family had, maybe they'd gone to an Australian Anglican kind of situation, church, but they didn't have any religious perspective, no teachings. They didn't go to any churches. So Merton had no religious upbringing. His parents were both artists. So, and they traveled a good bit. So they met, I think, maybe in England. So they're living in France, and Thomas is born. He's their first child. They have another son a couple years later named John Paul. He's born in 1918. John Paul is going to later die quite young during World War II. I'll say something about that. So Merton loses his whole family quite young. So he's 6 years old when his mother, Ruth, her last name was Jenkins, dies. And when Merton went to the hospital, his mother didn't want him to come into the hospital. So his father made him sit in the car outside the hospital. He's 6 years old, just a little boy. And he's dealing with the awesomeness of this experience, and he doesn't have anybody to counsel him. And he certainly doesn't have any religious inspiration, and what do you say at this point? So it's a very, your heart kind of goes out to a kid who's dealing with something all by himself. But this is how Merton has kind of come into the world a little bit. But his mother wrote a beautiful little book. It's a mother's book. It's called Tom's Book, and you can buy a copy of this. It's very short, but it's a kind of diary of a mother with her first child. It's a very maternal, and so Tom went outside today, and he looked at the sun and he said, oh my, oh pretty, things like that. So he just loves words, he loves pencils. She was, thinking like most parents, I've got a gifted child, he's a genius, he's going to be smart, he's attentive to everything. That's the theme of that little book. Where it's really kind of interesting, though, if you read this, Tom's Book by Ruth Jenkins, is the story of her mother-in-law coming to visit for the first time. And boy, is she panicked that her mother-in-law, what's her mother-in-law, do I clean, do I cook, do I do anything right? Is she going to tell me how I should raise this kid? I've never even had a kid before. She was just scared to death of her mother-in-law coming and what she was going to think of her. But she was very protective of Tom. She loved him, but she was very distant. She didn't seem to kind of even know what to say to him. And then she dies so early, and she disallows him to come into the hospital. Now his father is going to die a little bit later, but let me get to that. After his mother dies of cancer, they go back to the States for a little bit, but then they go back to France. His brother, John Paul, stays with some relatives. But young Tom Merton, goes with his father back to France. And at one point, Tom moves to England, stays with an aunt, begins attending school, and then later a man becomes kind of his, what's the word for someone who's not the parent, a guardian, is appointed guardian of him. And so he doesn't see his father. This is after his father's death, which is 1931. I think Merton is about 16 at the time, and his father, Owen, dies of a brain tumor. So Tom Merton doesn't have his brother around because he's living with relatives, but now his father has died. Now, after his mother died, his father, being a highfalutin artist and kind of a, running around the world kind of guy, met other girls or other women, and so he had some other relationships, and Tom was watching this. This is the world he's in, and he's moving around. At one point, though, he goes to Italy, and he goes to Rome, and he goes to some art museums, and he is completely blown away by what he sees. The religious atmosphere, the climate, the paintings, the symbols, the sheer art of the art just pulverized him. It just knocked him down, knocked him for a loop. He had nothing to use to interpret what he was sensing, but it just drove just like a beam through him, and he could not resist the idea of beauty and art and meaningfulness existing. But he had not really experienced it in a normal kind of childhood. And so that was like another world to him. But after his father dies, 1933, Tom is 18. And now he moves, he travels to Italy, as I was saying, and then he moves to the United States, to New York, in the summer. So 1933, Merton comes to the U.S., and he's going to stay in the U.S. for the rest of his life until the final year. He returns to England, though, where he's gotten into some trouble. Now, this is one of the stories why Tom Merton may not become a saint officially, because he got a girl pregnant. Later, he fell in love with a nurse as he was a monk, and so that gets kind of a doozy as well. But the historians think that during World War II, that the young girl and the child were killed during the Blitzkrieg. So no one has ever been able to find any kind of track of their lives after World War II. You remember the stories of that war and what Germany did in bombing England, London particularly. So he leaves for the United States. He lives with some relatives, but then he goes to college. So he's born kind of on his own. And he has this family, and he loves his family, but they all kind of disappear from him. And some people psychologicalize this story and say, well, that's why he went to the monastery. He needed a family. But that's not really what Merton wrote about. It's not really what was haunting him. What was haunting him was communion with reality itself. But he goes to college, and he's a brain. Thomas Merton, if you read his writings, you can tell he's intelligent. He wrote about 70 books. And I'm going to try to write my first book in my life this fall. 70 books. He died when he was 53. I'm already over that. So I was like, I'm so far behind. Even the monks were unprepared to realize how industrious he was as a monk, and how many writers and the correspondence he had. More about that a little later. He was just kind of a quiet guy like them. They had no idea what was coming out, just mushrooming from him. But he was very smart, so he did very well in college. He wrote for a magazine. He drew some illustrations, some of them kind of bawdy. He wrote a lot of poetry. He was political. He got in. There's a lot of intellectuals in the early 20th century. He got into the Communist Party for a little bit, and then he got back out. Don't hold that against him. Just almost everybody who was an intellectual in the 20s and 30s and flirted a little bit with another system, because the world was clearly falling apart to everybody. And they were looking for something, what's going to hold things together. This is a spiritual understanding that Merton is seeking. What does hold things together? And he can't forget those art museums and the Catholic churches that he went into. Well, while he's at college, he going back and forth to school, he would pass this bookstore, and he would read everything. But then he started to read some religious books, and the first one that really opened his mind was Gilson's The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy. And what this did for Merton is, as a thinking person, he read somebody who was a thinking person but who was also religious, and he had no clue that that was possible. He had never heard of such a thing. He thought religious things and religion were diametrically opposed to being a thinking person, and he was a thinking person. And he was an artistic person, but religion didn't have anything to do with art. So that experience in Italy cracked open his world a little bit to where this beauty was religious, and he was thunderstruck by this. Well, then later when he reads this intellectual French Catholic philosopher, his mind breaks open, and he starts to attend a Catholic church. He starts to read other things, and then all of a sudden he wants to be a monk. He just sort of flips. He doesn't go to church, and then all of a sudden he's got to go to church, and I don't just need to go to church, I need to go be a monk now. So this is seemingly a wild swing, but it cannot be explained other than to realize that this was how he was motivated from the beginning. This was not just a spontaneous kind of flippant idea. His whole life was already oriented to show me what is real, and then he's just going to embrace that. And so when he just all of a sudden went religious, and then let's go full tilt, let's just be a monk. After partying, smoking, going to jazz clubs, playing the bongo drums, getting girls pregnant, he's already led the party life, kind of like Augustine did. But the whole time, he's born contemplative, I would say. And he's been contemplating reality, but he had no context, no forms to work with, nothing, no traction. And then when things started to click, he was paying attention to things that were clicking inside of him. And then he knew this is what he was supposed to do. And of course, he was, right on target. He goes to the monastery, and that's where he stays the rest of his life. Has some problems there. But he goes there, and that started. So he becomes a member of the Catholic Church in 1938. He goes to graduate school, goes to master's. He's an English major, so he does his master's thesis on William Blake. He's a poet. More about this a little later. Then he plans to go get his doctorate in English, and he's going to write his Ph.D. dissertation on Catholic poet Gerald Manley Hopkins. But then when he decides he's got to be a monk, he scraps education. He was teaching at St. Bonaventure in New York. First, he applies in 1940 to the Franciscans, and they accept him. And then Merton has a second thought, and he calls them and goes, I don't know if this means anything to you, but I got this girl pregnant, and I just think I should tell you that. I don't know if that makes a difference. And they thought about it, and it kind of did make a difference. And they called him back and said, we're going to have to refuse you. Where he went to some professors that he had at Columbia who were Catholic and knew something about monasteries, and one of them said, why don't you try the Trappists? They've got one down in Kentucky. So during Easter, Holy Week, he went down to Gethsemane. As soon as he knocked on the door and they opened it, and says, hello, brother, something like, we've been looking for you. He just felt he was home. He felt he was in, and not just home personally and psychologically, he felt he was home in the universe. He thought he had hit the heart of reality here. It's where he was supposed to be. But he had no idea, but he had a sensibility about it. So that was Holy Week. That's in April of 1941. December, right before Pearl Harbor Day, he starts to make his way on back down the bus trip train to Kentucky. And on December 10th, 1941, he entered the monastery at age 27. So he's had a family that's kind of disappeared. He's had an intellectual kind of an artistic upbringing, but void of orientation to things. But all this while, a very intense attentiveness to the meaningfulness of reality. This is it burdens him. Now, does that make sense? Have you heard this before? Is this? Do you have a sense?